My name is Sarah Martinez, and what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about family, loyalty, and greed. 3 months ago, I was living what I thought was a peaceful life in the house I inherited from my grandmother. Today, I'm sitting in a lawyer's office, holding documents that prove my own family tried to steal a fortune worth over $2 million from me. But let me start from the beginning, because this story is far more twisted than you could ever imagine. I was 28 when my grandmother Elena passed away. She had raised me since I was 12, after my parents died in a car accident. Grandma Elena was everything to me, my mother, my father, my best friend, and my guide through life. She lived in this beautiful old Victorian house on Maple Street, a house that had been in our family for 3 generations. The neighborhood had changed over the years, becoming more upscale, but that house remained our sanctuary. When Grandma Elena died, she left the house to me. It wasn't a surprise, we had talked about it many times. She always said the house should stay with someone who would love it and take care of it the way she had. My uncle Robert, her son, had moved to California years ago and rarely visited. My Aunt Margaret, her daughter, lived across town but had always made it clear she thought the old house was too much work and should be sold. The will reading was straightforward. I inherited the house, along with some savings and personal belongings. Uncle Robert inherited some investments, and Aunt Margaret got Grandma's jewelry collection and some cash. Everyone seemed satisfied with the arrangement, or so I thought. For the first year after Grandma's death, I lived peacefully in that house. I worked as a graphic designer, mostly freelancing from home, which allowed me to really appreciate the space. I spent my evenings in Grandma's old garden, maintaining the roses she had planted decades ago. I converted her sewing room into my office and kept most of her furniture because it felt like keeping her memory alive. The house was large, 4 bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms, a spacious kitchen, a formal dining room, and a living room with a beautiful fireplace. The basement was partially finished, and there was even a small attic space. For someone living alone, it was definitely more space than I needed, but I loved every corner of it. I loved the creaky stairs that announced visitors, the way the morning light streamed through the stained glass window and the front door, and the smell of lavender that seemed permanently embedded in the walls from Grandma's sachets. But then, everything changed. It started about 18 months after Grandma's death. Uncle Robert began calling more frequently. At first, I was happy about it. I thought maybe he was feeling nostalgic and wanted to connect with family. Our conversations were pleasant enough. He'd ask how I was doing, how work was going, and inevitably, how I was managing with such a big house. "Sarah, honey," he would say, "that house is a lot of responsibility for a young woman like you. Have you thought about what you'll do when major repairs are needed? The roof, the plumbing, the electrical system, those old houses can be money pits." I assured him I was fine. I had been setting aside money for maintenance, and honestly, the house was in better condition than he made it sound. Grandma had been meticulous about upkeep, and she had updated most of the major systems in the years before she passed. Then Aunt Margaret started visiting more often. At first, I welcomed her company. She would bring groceries and we'd cook dinner together, reminiscing about Grandma. But gradually, her visits became more frequent and her behavior more peculiar. She started asking detailed questions about the house, about rooms I didn't use much, about Grandma's belongings, about whether I had explored every corner of the property. "You know, Sarah," she said one evening as we sat in the kitchen, "Mother was always very secretive about certain things. She had her little hiding spots and private corners. Have you found anything interesting while you've been living here?" I found the question odd, but I answered honestly. "Nothing unusual, Aunt Margaret. Just Grandma's normal belongings, photo albums, some old letters, her recipe collection." "Why do you ask?" She waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, you know how older people can be. They sometimes keep important documents in strange places, or forget to mention things. I just want to make sure you're not missing anything that might be important." These conversations started to make me uncomfortable, but I attributed it to grief. Maybe they were both struggling with losing Grandma and were looking for ways to feel connected to her memory. But then, the pressure intensified. Uncle Robert started suggesting that I should consider selling the house. "Sarah, you're young and talented. You could sell that place, get a nice apartment somewhere more convenient, and have money left over to invest in your future. You're wasting your prime years rattling around in that old house." When I told him I wasn't interested in selling, he became more persistent. He started sending me real estate listings, market analyses, and articles about the financial benefits of homeownership versus renting for young professionals. He even had a real estate agent call me, claiming he had heard I might be interested in selling. Aunt Margaret took a different approach. She started expressing concern about my safety. "It's not safe for a young woman to live alone in such a big house," she would say. "What if something happened to you? What if someone broke in? That neighborhood might look nice, but you never know what kind of people are around." She began suggesting that I should move in with her temporarily, just until I could figure things out. She had a spare room, she said, and I could save money while deciding what to do with the house. I started to feel like I was being tag-teamed. Every conversation with either of them somehow circled back to the house, why I should sell it, why I shouldn't live there alone, why it was too much responsibility for someone my age. The pressure was constant and exhausting. But I stood my ground. The house was my inheritance, my home, and my connection to Grandma. I wasn't going to be bullied into giving it up. That's when things escalated dramatically. One morning in late September, I woke up to find Uncle Robert's car in my driveway. I hadn't been expecting him. He lived over 2,000 miles away and usually called before visiting. When I opened the front door, I found him with two other men I didn't recognize. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said, pushing past me into the house. "These are my attorneys, Mr. Davidson and Mr. Chen." I was still in my pajamas and robe, completely caught off guard. "Uncle Robert, what's going on? You can't just show up here with lawyers without warning me." "Mr. Davidson, a stern-looking man in an expensive suit, spoke up. "Ms. Martinez, we're here because there's been an error regarding your grandmother's will. We have evidence that suggests the property transfer was not legally valid." My heart started pounding. "What are you talking about? What error?" Uncle Robert sat down in Grandma's favorite chair without being invited. "Sarah, I've been trying to handle this delicately, but you've left me no choice. Mother wasn't competent when she made her final will. She was suffering from dementia, and the document leaving you this house isn't legally binding." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. "That's not true. Grandma was sharp as a tack until the day she died. Her doctor will tell you that. Everyone who knew her will tell you that." Mr. Chen pulled out a folder. "We have medical records that suggest otherwise. Your grandmother was experiencing cognitive decline in her final years. Any legal documents she signed during this period are questionable." I knew this was impossible. Grandma had been active in her community right up until her death. She balanced her own checkbook, maintained her garden, and had long, coherent conversations with friends and neighbors. If she had been suffering from dementia, I would have been the first to know. "I want to see those medical records," I demanded. "That can be arranged," Mr. Davidson said, "but the immediate issue is that you're living in a property that may not legally belong to you. We're prepared to file a court challenge to the will, but we'd prefer to handle this amicably." Uncle Robert leaned forward. "Sarah, I don't want to hurt you. Your family. But this house should have come to me as the eldest child. Mother obviously wasn't thinking clearly when she made these arrangements. I'm willing to let you stay here temporarily while we sort this out, but ultimately, this property needs to be transferred to its rightful owner." I was shaking with anger and fear. "Get out of my house. Right now. If you want to challenge the will, do it through proper legal channels. But you have no right to come here and intimidate me." Mr. Chen stood up. "Ms. Martinez, we're trying to be reasonable here. If you force us to go through the courts, this could get very expensive for everyone involved. Wouldn't it be easier to work out an arrangement between family members?" "The arrangement was already worked out," I said, my voice getting louder. "Grandma left me this house because she wanted me to have it. Now get out before I call the police." Uncle Robert's expression hardened. "Sarah, you're making a mistake. You can't fight this. I have resources you don't have, and I have legal grounds you can't dispute. Don't make this harder than it has to be." After they left, I immediately called the lawyer who had handled Grandma's estate, Mr. Peterson. Unfortunately, he had retired, and his practice had been taken over by a younger attorney who was unfamiliar with the case. I explained what had happened, and she agreed to review the files and get back to me. But before I could hear back from her, Aunt Margaret arrived. She knocked on my door that evening, looking distraught. "Sarah, honey, I heard about Robert's visit today. I'm so sorry this is happening." I let her in, grateful to have what I thought was an ally. "Aunt Margaret, this is crazy. You know Grandma was fine mentally. You visited her regularly. You can testify to her mental state, can't you?" She sat down heavily on the couch. "Oh, Sarah, I wish it were that simple. But Robert showed me some things that are very troubling. Medical records, notes from Grandma's doctor. It seems like she was hiding her condition from all of us." My heart sank. "You believe him?" "I don't want to," she said, reaching for my hand. "But the evidence is pretty convincing. And honestly, looking back, there were signs. Sometimes when I visited, Grandma seemed confused about dates or couldn't remember conversations we'd had. I thought it was just normal aging, but maybe it was more serious." I pulled my hand away. "That's not true." Grandma was sharp. She was managing her own affairs, her own finances, everything. Aunt Margaret sighed. "Sarah, I know this is hard to accept. But even if the will is valid, you have to think practically. Can you really afford to fight Robert in court? He has money, he has lawyers, and he has medical evidence. Even if you win, the legal fees could bankrupt you." She paused, looking around the living room. "And honestly, honey, is this really the life you want? You're young, you're talented, you should be out there building your career, maybe finding someone to settle down with. Instead, you're stuck in this old house, living in the past." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "This is my home, Aunt Margaret. Grandma wanted me to have it. But what if she didn't?" Aunt Margaret asked gently. "What if her mind was already going when she made that decision? What if she wasn't capable of understanding what she was doing?" That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about every interaction I'd had with Grandma in her final years, looking for signs of cognitive decline that I might have missed. But I couldn't find any. She had been herself until the end, caring, intelligent, occasionally stubborn, but definitely competent. The next morning, I called Grandma's doctor, Dr. Williams. He had been her physician for over 20 years. "Dr. Williams, I need to ask you about my grandmother's mental state in her final years. Did she show any signs of dementia or cognitive decline?" There was a pause. "Sarah, I can't discuss specific medical details without proper authorization, but I can tell you that your grandmother was one of my sharpest patients right up until she passed. She never showed any signs of dementia or significant cognitive decline." "But there are medical records suggesting otherwise," I said. "Records that my uncle's lawyers have." Another pause, longer this time. "Sarah, I think you need to be very careful here. If someone is claiming to have medical records from my practice that contradict what I'm telling you, then something is very wrong. I would recommend you get a lawyer immediately." That conversation gave me hope, but it also scared me. If Uncle Robert's lawyers had fabricated medical records, this was much more serious than a simple family dispute over inheritance. I spent the next week trying to find a good attorney who specialized in estate law. The problem was that most of the lawyers I contacted wanted substantial retainers up front, and my savings were limited. I was starting to understand what Aunt Margaret had meant about not being able to afford a legal fight. But then, Uncle Robert forced my hand. I came home from a grocery run to find him in my kitchen. He had somehow gotten inside. Later I would discover he had kept a key from when he used to visit Grandma. "Sarah, we need to finish our conversation," he said calmly, as if breaking into my house was perfectly normal. "How did you get in here? You can't just enter my house without permission." "This isn't your house," he said matter-of-factly. "That's what we need to discuss. I've filed the court challenge to the will. The legal process has begun." He handed me a stack of papers. "These are the medical records I mentioned, along with the formal challenge. You have 30 days to respond through an attorney." I flipped through the documents, my hands shaking. The medical records appeared to be from Dr. Williams' practice, but they described a patient I didn't recognize, someone suffering from moderate to severe dementia, someone who couldn't remember family members' names or manage basic daily tasks. "These are fake," I said. "I just spoke to Dr. Williams. He told me Grandma never showed signs of dementia." Uncle Robert smiled coldly. "Dr. Williams is an old man, Sarah. His memory isn't what it used to be. Besides, these records speak for themselves. You forged these documents." "That's a very serious accusation," he said. "I hope you're prepared to prove it in court. In the meantime, I think it would be best for everyone if you moved out voluntarily. I don't want to have to evict my own niece, but I will if necessary." "You can't evict me from my own house." "Watch me," he said, heading for the door. "You have until the end of the month to make arrangements. After that, I'll be taking possession of the property." That night, I called every lawyer in the phone book, desperate to find someone who would take my case. Most of them wouldn't even return my calls once they heard I couldn't pay a large retainer up front. The few who did speak to me were not encouraging. "Estate challenges based on mental competency are very difficult to defend," one lawyer told me. "If they have medical evidence, you'll need expert witnesses, medical testimony, and a lot of time and money to build a case. Even then, it's not a sure thing." I was starting to feel hopeless when I remembered something Grandma used to say, "Sarah, when you're in trouble, look for the helpers. There are always helpers." I decided to reach out to Grandma's neighbors, her friends, anyone who had known her well in her final years. If I could get people to testify about her mental state, maybe I could challenge those fake medical records. Mrs. Chen, who lived next door, was horrified when I told her what was happening. "Your grandmother was sharp as a tack," she said indignantly. "We played bridge every Tuesday until the week before she died. She never missed a trick, literally or figuratively. If she had dementia, I would have noticed." Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived across the street, had similar reactions. "Elena was the one who organized our neighborhood watch meetings," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "She kept detailed notes, remembered everyone's concerns, and followed up on problems. A person with dementia couldn't have done all that." But when I asked if they would be willing to testify in court, most of them hesitated. Legal proceedings scared them, and Uncle Robert had already been around the neighborhood, talking to people, suggesting that Grandma's mental state had been worse than anyone realized. "He seemed like such a nice man," Mrs. Chen said apologetically. "He said he was worried that his mother had been hiding her condition because she was embarrassed. He made it sound like testifying would be helping her preserve her dignity. I realized Uncle Robert was systematically undermining any support I might have. He was smart, charming, and he had resources I didn't. He was also ruthless in a way I hadn't expected from family. As the end of the month approached, I became increasingly desperate. I had found a lawyer willing to take my case for a reduced fee, but even that was more than I could afford. And Uncle Robert's legal team was pressuring me constantly, calling several times a day, sending letters, and making it clear that they intended to make this as difficult as possible for me. Then, Aunt Margaret made her move. She arrived at my door on a Thursday evening, looking concerned and caring. "Sarah, honey, I've been thinking about your situation, and I have an idea that might help everyone." I let her in, hoping she had found a way to support me against Uncle Robert. "What if you moved in with me temporarily?" she suggested. "Just until this legal mess gets sorted out. You could rent out the house to cover the legal expenses, and you'd have a safe place to stay. It would take some of the pressure off." It wasn't a terrible idea, actually. If I could find reliable tenants, the rental income might help with legal fees. And staying with Aunt Margaret would reduce my living expenses. But what about Uncle Robert? I asked. Would he be okay with me renting out the house while the legal challenge is pending? "Let me handle Robert," she said. "I think I can convince him that this arrangement serves everyone's interests. You get some financial breathing room, he gets assurance that the property is being maintained, and I get to help my niece through a difficult time." Against my better judgment, I agreed. We shook hands on it, and I started making arrangements to move my most important belongings to her house. But I should have trusted my instincts. The next week, as I was packing my things, Uncle Robert showed up again. This time, he had a moving truck with him. "What's going on?" I demanded. "Margaret called me," he said. "She told me about your arrangement. I think it's a good idea, but I want to make sure the house is properly secured while it's empty." "It's not going to be empty. I'm going to rent it out." "Sarah, you can't rent out a property that's under legal dispute. That would complicate everything." "No, it's better if the house stays empty until the court makes its decision." I realized I had been set up. Aunt Margaret hadn't been trying to help me, she had been trying to get me out of the house so Uncle Robert could take control of it. "You're not taking my furniture," I said firmly. "This furniture belonged to my mother," Uncle Robert replied. "It goes with the house. The will specifically mentioned personal belongings. Grandma's furniture was left to me." "We'll let the court sort that out too," he said, gesturing to the moving men. "Gentlemen, please proceed." I watched helplessly as strangers loaded my grandmother's furniture I had grown up with, furniture that held decades of memories, into a truck. I wanted to physically stop them, but Uncle Robert's lawyers had made it clear that any interference could be considered obstruction and could hurt my case in court. When they were finished, the house looked like a skeleton. Empty rooms echoed with the sound of my footsteps. The warmth and personality that had made it a home were gone. "Sarah," Uncle Robert said as he prepared to leave, "I know this seems harsh, but I'm actually doing you a favor. You're young, you have your whole life ahead of you. Don't tie yourself down to an old house and old memories. Move on." That night, staying in Aunt Margaret's spare room, I felt more alone than I had since Grandma died. I had lost my home, my belongings, and apparently, my family's support. But what hurt most was the feeling that I had somehow betrayed Grandma's trust by not being strong enough to protect what she had left me. But the story was far from over. I spent the next few weeks feeling sorry for myself, but gradually, anger replaced despair. Uncle Robert and Aunt Margaret had manipulated me, lied to me, and stolen from me. They had dishonored Grandma's memory and trampled on her wishes. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I started investigating more thoroughly. I got copies of the medical records Uncle Robert's lawyers had submitted, and I took them to Dr. Williams. He was outraged. "These are absolutely fabricated," he said after reviewing them. "These aren't even on the correct forms. My practice has never used this type of documentation. And the medical language is all wrong. No doctor would write notes like this. Would you be willing to testify to that in court?" "Absolutely. In fact, I'm going to report this to the medical board and possibly the police. Forging medical records is a serious crime." That gave me hope, but I needed more evidence. I started digging into Uncle Robert's background, trying to understand what could motivate him to go to such lengths to steal my inheritance. What I discovered shocked me. Uncle Robert was in serious financial trouble. His business in California was failing, he owed massive amounts in taxes, and he was facing bankruptcy. He needed money desperately, and he saw Grandma's house as his salvation. But that wasn't the most shocking discovery. While staying at Aunt Margaret's house, I noticed she was acting strangely. She would disappear for hours at a time, claiming she was running errands, but she never seemed to bring anything home. She was also making a lot of phone calls that she would end abruptly when I entered the room. One day, I decided to follow her. She drove straight to Grandma's house. I parked down the street and watched as she let herself in with a key. She was inside for over 2 hours. When she came out, she was carrying several boxes, which she loaded into her car. That night, I confronted her. "Aunt Margaret, I saw you at Grandma's house today. What were you doing there?" She looked panicked for a moment, then tried to play it off casually. "Oh, that. Robert asked me to check on the place, make sure everything was secure. I picked up a few things that might get damaged if the house sits empty too long." "What kind of things?" "Just some of Mother's personal items. Photo albums, letters, that sort of thing." I knew she was lying, but I decided not to press the issue. Instead, I started paying closer attention to her behavior. Over the next week, I noticed that Aunt Margaret made several more trips to the house. Each time, she brought back boxes or bags. When I asked what she was collecting, she always had vague explanations about protecting Grandma's belongings or organizing things for the estate. But then I saw something that changed everything. I was in Aunt Margaret's basement, looking for extra blankets, when I noticed several boxes stacked in a corner. They were labeled with Grandma's address. Curious, I opened one of them. Inside, I found documents, lots of documents. Bank statements, investment records, insurance policies, and other financial papers. But these weren't the documents that had been part of the official estate. These were accounts I had never heard of. I opened another box and found more of the same. Then another. There were dozens of accounts, investments, and financial instruments that hadn't been included in Grandma's will. My hands were shaking as I started adding up the numbers. Conservative estimates put the total value at over $2 million. Grandma had been secretly wealthy, and Uncle Robert and Aunt Margaret knew about it. I realized what was happening. They weren't just trying to steal my house. they were trying to steal a fortune that should have been part of the estate. By getting me out of the house and taking control of it, they could systematically loot these hidden accounts without anyone knowing they existed. But why had Grandma hidden this money? And why hadn't it been included in her will? I spent the next several hours photographing every document in those boxes. Bank account numbers, investment portfolio statements, insurance policies, safe deposit box keys. It was a treasure trove of financial information. Some of the documents provided clues about Grandma's secrecy. There were letters from financial advisors discussing privacy concerns and discretionary management. There were notes in Grandma's handwriting about keeping things simple and avoiding complications. I began to understand that Grandma had intentionally kept these assets separate from her regular estate, possibly to avoid taxes or to maintain privacy. But legally, they should have been disclosed during the probate process. By hiding these assets, Uncle Robert and Aunt Margaret weren't just stealing from me, they were committing fraud against the probate court and tax evasion. The next morning, I made copies of everything and then carefully returned the boxes to exactly where I had found them. Aunt Margaret couldn't know that I had discovered her secret. But I needed help. This was beyond my ability to handle alone. I remembered that one of the lawyers I had contacted had mentioned that some attorneys would take cases on contingency if the potential recovery was large enough. With over $2 million at stake, I thought I might be able to find someone willing to take the risk. I called back the law office of Patricia Henderson, an estate attorney who had initially turned down my case due to my lack of funds. Ms. Henderson, this is Sarah Martinez. We spoke a few weeks ago about my inheritance dispute. I have some new information that might change your assessment of my case. What kind of information? Evidence of undisclosed assets worth over $2 million, and proof that my uncle has forged medical records to support his claim. There was a pause. Ms. Martinez, I think you'd better come in and see me immediately. 2 hours later, I was sitting in Ms. Henderson's office, showing her photographs of the documents I had found. This is incredible, she said, reviewing the bank statements. Your grandmother had substantial assets that were never disclosed to the probate court. That's a serious problem for anyone who knew about them and failed to report them. What does this mean for my case? It means you're not just defending against a will contest anymore. You're potentially looking at criminal charges against your uncle and aunt for fraud, forgery, and tax evasion. And you're looking at recovering millions of dollars that rightfully belong to the estate. Ms. Henderson agreed to take my case on contingency. Her first step was to file an emergency motion with the probate court, requesting an investigation into the undisclosed assets and asking for an injunction to prevent Uncle Robert and Aunt Margaret from accessing or disposing of any of Grandma's property or accounts. But we had to move fast. There was no telling how much of the hidden fortune they had already stolen. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal activity. Ms. Henderson filed motions, subpoenaed records, and contacted law enforcement about the forged medical documents. I provided her with detailed statements about everything that had happened, including Uncle Robert's threats and Aunt Margaret's deception. Meanwhile, I had to continue living with Aunt Margaret, pretending I didn't know what she was doing. It was one of the most difficult things I've ever had to do. Every morning, I had breakfast with the woman who was stealing my inheritance. Every evening, I made pleasant conversation with someone who was betraying my grandmother's memory. But I knew that if I confronted her too early, she might destroy evidence or warn Uncle Robert. The breakthrough came when Miss Henderson's private investigator tracked down the safe deposit boxes. Using the keys I had photographed, we were able to get a court order to examine the contents. What we found there was staggering. In addition to more financial documents, there were handwritten notes from Grandma explaining her financial arrangements. She had been systematic about hiding assets, but she had also been systematic about documenting everything. In her own words, she explained that she had kept these accounts separate because she wanted to ensure that her wealth would go to someone who would use it wisely. She had been planning to tell me about them when I turned 30, feeling that would be old enough to handle such responsibility. But she had died before my 30th birthday, and the secret had died with her, or so she thought. What Grandma hadn't anticipated was that Uncle Robert and Aunt Margaret had been snooping through her papers for years, looking for exactly this kind of information. They had known about the hidden fortune long before she died, and they had been planning to steal it all along. The most damning piece of evidence was a letter Grandma had written but never sent, addressed to me. In it, she explained the full extent of her wealth and expressed her hope that I would use it to help others and to make the world a better place. Sarah, the letter read, I know this will come as a surprise, but I want you to know that you will never have to worry about money. I've worked hard and invested wisely throughout my life, not for myself, but for you. This money is your security, your freedom, and your opportunity to make a difference in the world. I trust you to use it well. Reading that letter, sitting in a lawyer's office surrounded by evidence of my family's betrayal, I cried harder than I had since Grandma's funeral. Armed with this evidence, Ms. Henderson filed a comprehensive lawsuit against Uncle Robert and Aunt Margaret. We sued them for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, conversion, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We also reported their criminal activity to the district attorney's office. The response was swift and dramatic. Within a week, both Uncle Robert and Aunt Margaret had been arrested. The forged medical records led to charges of fraud and perjury. The hidden assets led to charges of tax evasion and conspiracy to commit fraud. But the legal victory was only part of my vindication. When news of the case became public, it created a sensation in our small community. The story of a young woman whose own family had tried to steal her inheritance resonated with people, and I received an outpouring of support. Mrs. Chen, my grandmother's bridge partner, organized a neighborhood petition supporting me. We all knew Elena was sharp as a tack, she told a local reporter. Anyone who claims she had dementia is either mistaken or lying. Dr. Williams went public with his outrage over the forged medical records. In 40 years of practice, I have never seen such a blatant attempt to manipulate the legal system, he said. Elena Martinez was one of the most mentally acute patients I've ever treated. Even some of Uncle Robert's former friends came forward to support me. It turned out he had been bragging about his plan to several people, apparently not realizing that most decent people would be horrified by what he was doing. The criminal cases moved quickly. Faced with overwhelming evidence, both Uncle Robert and Aunt Margaret accepted plea bargains rather than risk trials that could have resulted in much longer sentences. Uncle Robert pleaded guilty to fraud, forgery, and tax evasion. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution. His bankruptcy became unavoidable, and he lost everything he had been trying to save by stealing from me. Aunt Margaret pleaded guilty to conspiracy and tax evasion. She received 2 years of probation and a substantial fine. She also had to return every penny she had taken from the hidden accounts, plus interest and penalties. But beyond the criminal justice, there was the matter of the civil lawsuit. The court found that Uncle Robert and Aunt Margaret had systematically planned to defraud me of my inheritance. The judge was particularly harsh in his criticism of their behavior. The defendants in this case have demonstrated a level of greed and betrayal that is shocking even by the standards of family disputes, he said during the final hearing. They forged medical records, manipulated legal proceedings, and violated the trust of a grieving young woman. Their conduct was not just illegal, it was morally reprehensible. The court awarded me the full value of the estate, including all the hidden assets, plus punitive damages. The total recovery was over $2.8 million. But more importantly, the court restored my ownership of Grandma's house and all of her belongings. The day I moved back into the house was one of the most emotional days of my life. Miss Henderson had arranged for professional movers to bring back all of Grandma's furniture, exactly as it had been. Walking through those rooms, seeing everything back in its proper place, I felt like I could finally breathe again. I spent that first evening sitting in Grandma's favorite chair, reading the letter she had written but never sent. In it, she talked about her hopes for my future, her dreams of how I might use the resources she was leaving me, and her confidence that I would make choices that would make her proud. Remember, Sarah, she wrote, money is just a tool. It's not what makes you happy or successful or worthy. But in the right hands, it can be a powerful force for good. I know your hands are the right hands. With the legal battles behind me, I had to decide what to do with my unexpected wealth. Grandma had been right, it was overwhelming to suddenly have so much money and so much responsibility. I decided to take my time and make thoughtful decisions. First, I established a scholarship fund in Grandma's name for students studying medicine or social work, fields she had always admired. The fund provides full tuition assistance for students who demonstrate both academic excellence and a commitment to helping others. Second, I invested in fixing up the neighborhood. Many of the houses on our street were owned by elderly people who couldn't afford necessary repairs. I created a grant program to help seniors maintain their homes and age in place with dignity. Third, I used some of the money to start my own business. I had always been interested in sustainable design, and I opened a company that helps homeowners make environmentally friendly improvements to their properties. It's been successful, and it gives me a way to contribute.